The knife was still warm when they drove it into the ice. Captain Derek Rourke stood over the makeshift marker and said nothing. Around him, 7 men shifted their weight in the white silence, rifles low, breath rising in pale threads above their balaclavas. The wind came from the northeast in long, flat sheets, carrying snow that cut like ground glass. No one looked at the mound, no one could. The mound was where Sergeant Elena Voss had been. 3 hours ago, she had been behind them, covering their retreat through the Nordvik Pass. 3 hours ago, her voice had been in their earpieces, calm, methodical, reading wind and distance with the flat precision of someone reciting a grocery list. Wind 9 knots, northeast. Elevation drop 40 meters. Hold. Then the explosion. Not the crack of a rifle or the pop of a grenade. Something deliberate, something shaped. The kind of detonation that didn't happen by accident in a mountain pass that only 3 people in the entire Joint Command structure even knew existed. The snow wall on the eastern ridge had come down in a single, terrible exhale, tons of ice and frozen earth cascading into the narrow throat of the pass. It had swallowed the ridgeline where Elena lay. It had swallowed her hide position, her ghillie-wrapped silhouette, the H&H 408 she'd carried since Tbilisi. It had swallowed all of it in 4 seconds. Rourke had screamed her call sign into the radio. Nothing. He had screamed it again. Static. Recon specialist Marcus Webb had grabbed his arm. Sir, we have to move. There are 4 more shooters inbound from the... I know. He pulled free. He stood at the edge of the avalanche debris for exactly 11 seconds. He counted them, and then he turned and ordered the extraction. They moved. They survived. They shouldn't have. And now they stood at the mound they'd returned to build, 7 men in white winter whites digging through 2 meters of compacted snow with their hands and folding shovels, working until they found what they'd come to confirm. They found the ghillie wrap. They found the rifle case crushed, the stock shattered. They found no body. Because the weight of the snow had compressed everything so completely that distinguishing flesh from ice required a forensics team and time they didn't have. Sergeant First Class Calvin Briggs had handed Rourke the radio log. Missing in action, presumed killed. The language of bureaucratic grief. Rourke initialed it. Then he took his own knife, the K-bar he'd carried since Kandahar, the one with the compass etched into the pommel, and drove it into the frozen ground at the head of the mound, blade down, handle up. The way men in his line of work marked the places where the good ones fell. She doesn't get across? Private First Class Tyler Hansen asked. She got a knife, Rourke said. She'd want the knife. He wasn't sure that was true. He wasn't sure he knew what Elena would have wanted, because Elena Voss had never been the kind of person who told you what she wanted. She told you what she needed. She told you wind speed and hold points and whether the target was going to move left or right before he moved. She did not tell you what she wanted. What Rourke knew. She was 29 years old. She had been the best long-range shooter he had ever seen, and he had seen many. Her confirmed distance record stood at 2,940 meters and change, established during an interdiction mission in eastern Finland that officially did not happen. She spoke 4 languages. None of them. Conversationally, she used language the way she used a rifle, for precision and nothing else. She had a scar along her left jawline from a fragment hit in Murmansk. She had a habit of clicking her tongue twice before a difficult shot, so subtle that only the people standing directly beside her ever heard it. She had, in 4 years of working with his unit, never once asked to be relieved of a position. She was also, according to the paperwork now tucked into Rourke's chest pocket, dead. He looked at the knife handle rising from the snow. The compass on the pommel caught the gray light and threw a tiny, pale reflection across the white surface. He stared at it for a long moment. She doesn't get to die like this. He knew the thought was irrational. People died the way they died. The mountain didn't care about fairness. Neither did the enemy. He turned away. "Move out," he said. "We're needed at staging." No one argued. They filed back through the pass in single file, following the boot prints that were already beginning to fill with drifting powder. By the time they reached the tree line, the mound was invisible. By morning, the marker knife would be buried under new snow. By morning, the mound would be indistinguishable from the rest of the white, silent landscape. But Derek Rourke, walking at the rear of the column, did not look back. Not because the grief was too great, but because some part of him, the part that had survived by trusting things he couldn't explain, was listening to the mountain. The mountain was quiet. Too quiet. Not the quiet of a grave. Something else. He couldn't name it. He filed it away and kept walking. 72 hours later, the mountain was anything but quiet. The mission brief had been straightforward, which Rourke had learned to distrust. A reconnaissance element, 4 soldiers from the 3rd Alpine Battalion under Lieutenant Garrett Cole, had gone dark in the Hartvik Valley, 12 kilometers south of the Nordvik Pass. Last transmission, 17 hours prior. Weather between staging and the valley. A Category 4 whiteout developing from the north, expected to hold for 48 hours. So we go in before the whiteout closes, Rourke said. The intelligence officer, a thin woman named Captain Rachel Morse, slid a satellite image across the table. The last known position is here, in the valley floor. There's a structure, an old fire observation post. We believe Cole's element sheltered there when the first weather front hit. The problem? There's a shooter, Rourke said. Not a question. Morse's expression didn't change. Call sign Ghost of the Ridge, enemy sniper, one of their best. He's been working the mountain passes for the past 8 weeks. 7 confirmed kills, all long-range engagements, all occurring in identical conditions, low visibility, high wind. She paused. He picks his days. Rourke looked at the image. The valley was a natural bowl, granite walls rising on 3 sides, the only access route running through a narrow corridor from the north. A shooter on the eastern rim would have sight lines down the entire approach. How good? He asked. His longest confirmed shot is 2,800 meters, Morse said. He uses a suppressed system, possibly Russian. We've never gotten a precise fix on his position. Every engagement. He relocates before the acoustic signature can be triangulated. Rourke thought of Elena. Of the fluid certainty with which she'd moved through these mountains, reading terrain the way other people read road signs. He thought of who he would have sent to deal with Ghost of the Ridge, if Elena were alive. He filed that thought away too. Extraction window? He asked. 6 hours before the whiteout becomes impassable, Morse said. After that, there's no way in or out for 48 hours. If Cole's element is still alive now, they won't be in 48 hours. The temperature in that valley at night, I know what happens, Rourke said. He assembled the team himself. Webb, who could read terrain better than anyone left in the unit. Briggs, steady under fire. Corporal Dana Fitch, the team's field medic, because Cole's people had been out there without support for 17 hours, and Rourke wasn't naive enough to expect them to be uninjured. And 3 others. Private First Class Joel Hargreave, Specialist Owen Flynn, and Staff Sergeant Nathan Hollis, the team's communications specialist, who wore a slight smirk that Rourke had never trusted and never been able to justify distrusting. 7 people, the same number who had stood over Elena's mound. Rourke noticed, but said nothing. They inserted via helicopter to a position 4 kilometers north of the valley entrance, beyond the expected engagement range of Ghost of the Ridge. The bird went down fast and low, the pilots working the rotors in near silence against the rising wind. The drop took 9 seconds, then the helicopter was gone, vanishing back into the gray sky. And the 7 of them were standing in waist-deep powder with 12 kilometers to cover, and weather moving in from the north like a closing fist. They moved in spread formation, Webb on point, Rourke at center, Hollis trailing. The snow absorbed sound. Their footsteps made no noise. Their radio communication was reduced to 3-word bursts, because even encrypted signals could be detected by direction-finding equipment, and Ghost of the Ridge, whatever else he was, had shown a remarkable ability to anticipate movement patterns. The valley entrance came into view at hour 2. Webb raised a fist. Everyone stopped. Contact report, Webb murmured into the radio. East Ridge. Approximately 11 o'clock from the valley throat, Rourke said quietly. He'll be up high, where he can look down into the approach. We have maybe 300 meters of exposure from that door to the first rock formation on the left. Anyone who crosses that open ground is in his lane. Then nobody crosses that ground, Briggs said. Cole's people are in that valley, Rourke said. Briggs didn't answer. He didn't have to. They worked left, toward the rock formation, moving in 2-second rushes with full stops between. The wind came in gusts now, rattling the icy branches overhead, and between gusts, the silence was absolute. Rourke kept his eyes on the eastern ridge, kept watching the high ground. The first shot came without warning, as all the best shots do. It didn't hit any of them. It hit the ground 2 centimeters in front of Hargreaves' left boot, throwing a tiny geyser of ice crystals up into his face. Hargreaves stumbled backward. A range shot. A calibration. Down, Rourke barked. They went flat. Snow filled Rourke's mouth. He heard the wind. He heard nothing else, no report, no echo, nothing to triangulate. Ghost of the Ridge had fired from somewhere above them, and the mountain had swallowed the sound entirely. The second shot came 4 seconds later. It took Flynn in the shoulder. He didn't scream, he was good for that, but he went down hard, and Fitch was across to him in a combat crawl, before Rourke could order it. "How bad?" Rourke said. "Through and through," Fitch said. "He's mobile." The third shot didn't come. That was worse. Waiting is its own kind of dying. They were pinned against the rock formation, 6 of them flat in the snow. Flynn propped against the granite with Fitch's trauma dressing packed tight into the entry wound. The shooter hadn't fired again, which meant he was either relocating or waiting for one of them to move. Both options were equally bad. Rourke counted the variables. 1 enemy sniper, position unknown, elevated, with sightlines covering the only approach to the valley. 4 soldiers alive in the valley maybe. A whiteout building behind them. 0 fire support. His own team sniper had been buried under an avalanche 3 days ago. He had a 7.62 rifle and a very poor set of options. "We need smoke," he said. "Wind will diffuse it in 4 seconds at this gust rate," Webb said. "Then we need to move in 4 seconds or less." "Rourke." Briggs's voice was flat. "We can't." The shot came, but it didn't come from above. It came from the left, from the high southern ridge, which no one had been watching because no one had positioned anything up there. The crack arrived half a second after the impact, which meant the distance was enormous. Rourke's mind did the calculation automatically. At this altitude, at this temperature, a rifle report traveled at approximately 330 meters per second. Half-second delay. 165 meters between muzzle and target? No. That was wrong. The delay was longer than that. He'd heard it wrong in the wind. He looked at the eastern ridge. Ghost of the Ridge was no longer a threat. He lay in the snow at the edge of the ridgeline, visible for a fraction of a second before the wind shifted and the snow curtain closed again. He hadn't fallen, he'd simply ceased to be upright. One moment present, the next moment gone. A headshot. From the south, from somewhere that made no sense. Rourke stared at the southern ridge. White. Empty. Wind-scoured granite and snowfields and nothing, nothing, nothing. "What was that?" Hargreaves said. Nobody answered. Webb was already computing. Southern ridge is Christ. That's at minimum 3,200 meters from where he was positioned. Probably more. You can't hit a stationary target at 3,200 meters in a crosswind. You cannot make that shot. "Somebody just did," Fitch said quietly. Rourke's hand found the radio. His thumb hovered over the transmit button. He didn't press it. Whatever was on that southern ridge had just saved all of their lives. You didn't call out to something you didn't understand. You listened. The wind died for exactly 3 seconds. In that 3-second window, cutting through the silence from somewhere to the south and above, they heard it. 2 short pulses. A pause. 1 long. A pause. 2 short again. Rourke's blood ran cold, then hot, then cold again. He knew that pattern. He had not heard it in 72 hours. He had not expected to hear it ever again. "That's Briggs," started. "Don't," Rourke said. "Captain, that's her signal." I said don't. But he was already moving. The signal came again. Same pattern, south and high, pulling them along the base of the western wall, where the terrain afforded natural concealment. Whoever was up there knew exactly where they were, knew how to draw them without exposing them. Rourke didn't allow himself to think the name. He filed it somewhere below rational thought and moved on instinct, because instinct was what you had when reason turned to static. They followed the western wall, crouched, weapons up. Flynn was on Hargreaves' shoulder, now mobile, barely, the morphine from Fitch's kit keeping him functional. The whiteout was building behind them, the northern sky going the color of erasure. If they didn't find what they were looking for in the next 2 hours, there would be nothing to find. There would only be the storm. Another shot from the south ridge, this one without a target, a directional signal. This way, move. The path climbed. Rock steps buried under 6 inches of powder. A natural staircase in the cliff face that wasn't visible from below. Rourke had not known it was there. He would not have found it in 3 hours of searching. Someone was guiding them. At the third shot signal, Webb led them left around a granite outcropping and into a depression in the rock, a natural hollow where the cliff curved inward, sheltered from the wind on 3 sides. The temperature dropped 4 degrees simply from the absence of wind, which meant it was now -26, but it felt like warmth. At the back of the hollow, barely visible against the rock, was a human shape. Seated, back to the stone, rifle across the thighs, a different rifle, not the H&H, something scavenged from somewhere. Head leaned back, eyes open, covered in blood. Briggs moved forward first and went to one knee. He said nothing for a long moment. Then, "She's breathing." Rourke crossed the hollow in 4 steps. He crouched in front of her and looked. Elena Voss looked back at him. Her right eye was swollen shut, the tissue around it purple-black, a trauma impact pattern consistent with being hit by something heavy, ice, rock, debris. Her left eye was open and focused, and held the same flat, deliberate light it always held, as though she were looking through a scope rather than at a person. There was blood on the left side of her face from a scalp laceration that had stopped flowing and was now frozen in a dark streak from temple to jaw. Her left arm was held against her torso in a makeshift sling fashioned from what appeared to be strips of her ghillie wrap. The arm was broken visibly, the radius at an angle that made Rourke's stomach move. She had been alive in the snow for 72 hours. She had set a broken arm herself. She had climbed to the southern ridge with one functioning eye and a rifle she'd taken from somewhere he couldn't account for, and she had made a shot. The shot from 3,200 meters in a crosswind during a public Category 3 weather event. She looked at him and said, voice flat and barely above a whisper, "You buried my rifle." "We buried what we thought was you," Rourke said. "That was a $12,000 system. Elena, I want it back." He stared at her. Then something in his chest that had been locked for 72 hours came undone, and he looked away for exactly 2 seconds before he looked back. "Fitch," he said. Now, Fitch worked fast and said little, which was what made her good. Saline flush on the scalp laceration. It opened again, briefly, and Elena's jaw tightened, but she made no sound. Eye examination with a penlight, right side first, then left. The right eye was not lost, Fitch determined, but the orbital rim had taken a significant impact. Vision on that side was down to shadows. The left eye was intact, fully functional. Functioning well enough to have made the most difficult shot any of them had ever witnessed. The arm was the problem. The radius had fractured transversely a clean break, Fitch said, which was as good as fractures got, but the bone ends had shifted. Elena had splinted it with a rod she'd stripped from a section of her rifle case before the case was buried, using the strips of ghillie wrap as binding. The splint was textbook. Fitch stared at it for a moment before she said, quietly, "You did this yourself." "Nobody else was there," Elena said. "Does it hurt?" A pause. "Of course it hurts. I'm going to need to realign." "Do it." Fitch did it. Elena's breath came out through her teeth in a single controlled hiss. Her left hand found the rock beside her and her fingers pressed flat against it, white at the knuckles, and then she was still again, like something that had passed through and come out the other side. Rourke sat back against the opposite wall of the hollow and watched her and assembled the picture from the pieces he had. She had been in her hide position when the avalanche triggered. The snow wall had come down on the eastern side, not directly on her, but close enough that the pressure wave had thrown her laterally, off the ridgeline and down the steep western face. She'd fallen something between 20 and 30 meters before a subridge had caught her, the impact breaking her arm and damaging the orbital rim of her right eye. She had been partially buried, not the deep burial they'd assumed, but enough to require 30 minutes of slow, methodical digging with one functioning hand to free herself. She'd had nothing. No radio, the radio had been destroyed in the fall. No primary weapon. Emergency kit, partially intact, carrying the basics: water purification, fire start, a thermal emergency blanket the size of a playing card when folded, a first aid kit that didn't include what you needed for a broken radius, 400 rounds of 338 loose in a zippered pouch that she'd somehow kept throughout the fall. "Where did you get the rifle?" Webb asked. She glanced at him. Ghost of the Ridge had a hide position on the southern summit. He'd been using it for 6 weeks. There were ration wrappers going back to October. He left his secondary weapon cached there. She paused. "It's a Toknost, Russian system. 338 Lapua, long suppressor. He modified the trigger group. It's actually quite good." "You used an enemy rifle," Briggs said. "I used what was available to make a 3,200-meter shot," Webb said. She looked at him with her one functioning eye. 3,340, she said. "I had time to range it." Nobody spoke for a moment. "Cole's element," she said, shifting her gaze to Rourke. "There are 4 of them in the valley. 3 mobile, 1 with a leg wound. Ghost of the Ridge had them pinned 2 days ago. He took his shot and then sat on the valley entrance, waiting for anyone who came to help. Classic containment." She paused. "He won't be doing that anymore. We move as soon as Fitch is done," Rourke said. "I'm coming," Elena said. He looked at her, at the broken arm, at the ruined eye, at the rifle she'd carried up a mountain on a broken arm with one eye. He didn't argue. They moved at 1,400 hours, with the whiteout building behind them like a wall. Elena walked at Rourke's side, the Toknos slung across her back, her good arm free. She moved slowly, not her usual fluid efficiency, but steady. Whatever pain she was managing it somewhere internal and inaccessible, the way she managed everything. Rourke waited until they were far enough ahead of the others that his voice wouldn't carry. "The explosion," he said. "Tell me what happened." She didn't answer immediately. She watched the terrain ahead of them, cataloging it the way she always did: exits, elevations, cover and concealment. Then, 20 minutes before the avalanche, I picked up a transmission on the emergency frequency. Not intended for me. Probably didn't know I was on it. She paused. "Someone gave our position in the pass. Grid coordinates, precise ones, more precise than satellite imagery would give you. Someone gave them to the enemy. Someone who was at the mission brief," Rourke said. "Someone who had access to our movement plan." He felt the cold of it, which was different from the cold of the air. "You know who?" "I have a strong suspicion." Her voice carried no heat, no anger, just the flat precision she used for everything. "I need a closer look before I say a name. I need to see one more thing." "What thing?" She glanced at him. Her left eye, the one that still worked, was steady and focused, and gave away nothing. "I'll know it when I see it." He didn't push. He had learned, over 4 years, that pushing Elena Voss when she had made a decision about the timing of information was like pushing a granite wall. The information would come when she had decided it was time. He thought about Hollis, ran the calendar backward in his mind. Hollis had joined the unit 14 months ago, assigned through standard rotation, background check clean, performance reviews adequate. Not exceptional, never exceptional, and that, Rourke realized now, should have been a flag. You didn't get assigned to a unit like this by being adequate. You got assigned by being the best at something. Hollis had been good at communications, good at operations protocols, good at being unremarkable, good at being exactly what you'd need to be if someone had placed you here deliberately. The watch on his wrist, the transmissions on the wrong frequency, the precise grid coordinates that required intimate knowledge of movement plans. Knowledge that came from the brief room, not from the field. Rourke thought about who else might be in that chain. Who else might have been bought or coerced. He thought about Captain Morse and the thin, careful way she'd laid out the satellite imagery. He thought about the intelligence officer before her, the one who had briefed the Nordvik mission. He thought about all the invisible hands that moved information through channels, and how many of those hands had prices. "How deep does it go?" he asked. Elena was quiet for a long moment. Ice crystals moved across the surface of the snow beside her boot. "I don't know," she said. "Hollis is the mechanism I can prove. The people who paid him, that's a different investigation." She paused. "I'm a sniper. I deal in distances I can range. Fair, Rourke said. He kept moving. They reached the valley entrance at 1,430. The corridor was 40 meters wide at its narrowest point, the killing ground that Ghost of the Ridge had covered so effectively. With Ghost gone, the corridor was just a corridor. They moved through it in 20 seconds, fast and spread wide, and came out into the valley floor. The observation post was 200 meters ahead. Stone walls, a corrugated roof half collapsed under snow load, a chimney with a thin thread of smoke rising from it. Cole's people had fire. Cole's people were alive. Rourke exhaled something he'd been holding for hours. He keyed the radio. Cole, this is Rourke. We're on the valley floor, 200 meters south of your position. Show me a signal. A pause. Then a flashlight blinked 3 times from the window slit of the observation post. Move up, Rourke said. They moved. During the approach, Elena dropped back slightly. Rourke noticed, but kept moving. She wasn't retreating. She was watching something. He didn't break formation to check. He trusted her. At 40 meters from the post, he heard her inhale. Short, controlled. The particular quality of a breath taken before certainty arrives. He filed it away and knocked on the stone wall of the post with the butt of his rifle. The door, a warped wooden frame draped with a thermal blanket, opened from the inside, and Lieutenant Cole's face appeared, exhausted and frost-burned and alive, which was all that mattered. God, Cole said. I didn't think. Save it, Rourke said. 4 bodies? 3 walking. Marsh has a through and through in the left thigh. He's been keeping the fire. Fitch, Rourke said. Fitch moved past him and into the post. The others filed in behind her. Rourke stood in the doorway for a moment and looked back across the valley floor. Elena stood at the southern edge of the post's exterior wall, very still. She was looking at Staff Sergeant Nathan Hollis. Hollis was looking at the ground. The temperature inside the observation post was barely above freezing, but it felt tropical after the valley. Fitch worked on Marsh's leg wound, while Cole gave Rourke the situation in flat, economical sentences. They'd been on a standard reconnaissance route when the first contact came. Ghost of the Ridge, taking Corporal Aldea in the first second. Single shot, no warning. They'd gone to ground and stayed there, unable to move without presenting targets. 4 days of rationed food, and 1 working radio whose battery had died 17 hours prior. We heard the shot, Cole said. The one that took him down. I didn't understand where it came from. Neither did we, Rourke said. Elena had come inside. She stood near the eastern wall, back to the stone, the toknost leaning against her right thigh. She was looking at Hollis. Hollis had positioned himself near the door. Tactical choice, probably unconscious near the exit. He was checking his weapon, busy with something at the rail. He hadn't acknowledged Elena since they'd entered the post. Not once. Most people who saw Elena Voss walk in from the dead spent at least 30 seconds staring. Hollis had not looked up. Rourke watched Elena watching Hollis, and the cold feeling returned. When did you last update command with our approach route? He asked Hollis, keeping his voice casual. Hollis looked up. I sent the standard confirmation signal during insertion, sir. That's SOP. What frequency? Primary tactical, sir. Elena said, from the wall. Primary tactical was compromised in the Nordvik incident. We shifted to secondary for this mission. Per the brief. A pause. Just a beat too long. Right, Hollis said. Secondary. I misspoke. Elena's eye held on him. Your radio log would show which frequency the signal went on, she said, not which frequency you said you used. Another pause. Hollis set his weapon down. The motion was slow, deliberate, and it was not the motion of someone placing a weapon because he was tired of holding it. It was the motion of someone who has decided the weapon is not his best option at this moment. Cole, Rourke said quietly, take your people to the back corner. Cole was an experienced soldier. He didn't ask why. He moved. Hollis, Rourke said, we need to talk about Nordvik. What happened next was fast, the way these things always are. Hollis moved left, toward the door. And he was quick, quicker than Rourke expected. He got the door open. He got 1 step outside. The cold came in like a blade. Then he stopped. Elena was outside already. She'd moved before anyone registered it around the exterior of the post, through the small gap in the rear wall, across the snow-crusted ground. She stood 6 meters ahead of him in the gray afternoon light, the talknost hanging in her good hand, angled but not raised. Her one functioning eye was on him. "You gave them our position," she said. Hollis said nothing. His breath came fast and visible in the cold. "You knew the pass. You knew the timing. You knew my hide position." Her voice had the same flat precision as always. No heat, no accusation, just facts, arranged in order. "They paid you to keep us in the pass long enough for the detonation. You don't know. You're wearing a tactical watch I've never seen before this mission. Military-grade GPS tracker integration. The kind that transmits a beacon on a frequency that doesn't interfere with standard comms." She paused. "Ghost of the Ridge wasn't finding us by terrain analysis. He was following your signal." Hollis's jaw tightened. Something moved across his face, not guilt, exactly. The calculation of a person who has considered all exits and is finding them systematically closed. "The beacon frequency," he said. "You can't read a beacon frequency with field equipment." "No," Elena said. "But when you spent 3 nights in Nordvik before the mission, I could hear an intermittent bleed on the satellite uplink channel, 4-digit burst transmission every 12 hours. I ran the timing against Ghost's engagement windows." She tilted her head slightly. They lined up. Hollis looked at the ground. Something in him that had been taught went slack. "How much?" Rourke said from the doorway. Hollis said nothing. "How much was it worth?" Rourke said. His voice was quiet, which was worse than anger. Anger was something you could argue with. Quietness just accumulated. "How much was 5 soldiers worth to you? How much was she worth?" Hollis raised his eyes to Elena. There was something there, not remorse, but something adjacent to it. The specific discomfort of a man forced to look at the concrete result of an abstract decision. He had sold coordinates and position reports. He had probably not permitted himself to imagine the person at the end of the targeting data. Standing in the snow now, with the person looking back at him with one ruined eye and a broken arm and the absolute steadiness of someone who had survived what he'd meant to kill her with, he was being forced to imagine. It was not a comfortable imagination. 6 figures, Hollis said. American. Nobody spoke. "I want a lawyer," he said. "You'll get one," Rourke said, "when we get back. Which you should be grateful we're making possible." Hollis glanced at Elena again. She hadn't moved, hadn't blinked. The talknost was still at her side, not raised, which was somehow more unnerving than if it had been. "You should have died," he said. Not cruelly, almost with wonder. "I know," she said. "I decided not to." Rourke crossed to Hollis. Zip ties from the kit on his vest. Wrists behind, standard prisoner protocol. Hollis complied. His hands were steady, which told Rourke he'd considered this possibility and made some kind of peace with it. The equanimity of someone who has run his gamble and lost. Rourke walked him back inside. Rourke had Hollis zip-tied and seated against the exterior post wall within 2 minutes. Hollis didn't resist. The fight had gone out of him, or he'd made a calculation about his odds and arrived at the correct answer. While Webb monitored Hollis and Fitch finished with Marsh's wound, Elena went back inside the post and sat against the interior wall. Rourke sat across from her. The fire between them, a small contained thing in a stone ring, threw orange light across her face and made the frozen blood on her jaw look almost black. "Tell me about the 72 hours, he said. She was quiet for a moment. The fire clicked and shifted. When the snow stopped moving, I was 12 meters below the ridgeline, partially buried torso and legs, not my head, which is the version you want." She paused. "The arm was broken in the fall, before I went under. The eye impact was from the initial pressure wave. Something hit the right side of my face." She looked at the fire. Digging took time. The snowpack was dense, but not fully set. I had my hands free, and I could use the knife from my kit, the boot knife, which survived because it's small. "You should have stayed put," Rourke said. "Called for help. My radio was destroyed, and I'd heard the transmission." She glanced at him. "I knew someone had targeted us. I didn't know who. If I'd made it back to staging, I didn't know who to trust." Rourke felt that land. She'd been out here alone for 3 days, not only because she was physically stranded, but because she hadn't known who among them was the enemy. "So you stayed in the field?" I identified Ghost of the Ridge's secondary hide on the southern summit 2 weeks ago during a previous mission. I'd noted it as a contingency. His cached weapon was there, 400 rounds of 338. She looked down at her broken arm, encased now in Fitch's proper splint, clean and white. I climbed up on the second day, when the weather was better. Established a position. Waited for us. Waited for the right moment. Her eye came back up to his. You were going to come back. That valley had 4 people alive in it, and you were going to come for them regardless of what the weather said. A slight pause. I know how you think. He didn't say anything. Ghost of the Ridge had positioned on the eastern ridge the night before you arrived. I watched him set up his position through the Toknost scope for 9 hours before you reached the valley entrance. I waited until he engaged. I needed him to commit, to be stationary and focused. She paused. The crosswind at that distance, at that elevation, I calculated it for most of the night. The temperature differential between the southern ridge and the eastern creates a layered wind structure. You don't just compensate for the surface wind. You have to estimate the wind at each altitude band the round passes through. 3,340 meters, Rourke said. $3,000, 340, she confirmed. In a crosswind. It was manageable. He stared at her across the fire. She stared back, one-eyed, blood-streaked, arm in a splint, holding herself with the same still certainty she'd always had, as though being buried alive and climbing a mountain on a broken arm in a whiteout to make an impossible shot was simply what the situation required, and the situation had been met. Why the whistle, he said. Why not just radio us when you knew Hollis wasn't a risk anymore? I didn't want to explain it over a radio he might have been monitoring. She paused. And I needed you to follow me to the hollow. I needed you to see the condition I was in before I made the approach. So, you'd understand the margin was real. The margin. If I'd miscalculated. If the shot had been off. I needed you to know I had been here. And what I'd done. And why. In case it didn't work. She looked at the fire again. It worked. Rourke was quiet for a long time. Outside, the wind picked up. The whiteout was arriving. Through the gap in the door, snow was beginning to move sideways, horizontal and relentless, and the light was changing from gray to the flat, textureless white of a full-ground blizzard. They would be here for the night, at minimum, possibly longer. You're going to be okay, he said finally. I know, she said, not with arrogance, just with the same flat certainty, as though the question had been answered a long time ago, in the dark, under the snow, and she was simply reporting the result. The whiteout hit full force at 1,800 hours and was merciless through the night. They burned everything combustible they could find. Broken furniture from the post's interior, the wooden doorframe, the stock of a damaged rifle from Cole's equipment. The fire stayed alive. All 9 of them, Rourke's team, Cole's element, Hollis zip-tied and separated, stayed alive with it, cold and still and very alive. In the pre-dawn hours, when the storm had exhausted itself and the wind had dropped to something merely brutal rather than he found her outside. Standing in 3 inches of fresh powder, the Toknost in her good hand, looking south. What is it? He said quietly. She didn't answer for a moment, just watched. Then, he had a partner. Ghost of the Ridge? He's not a solo operator. He never was. The containment of Cole's element was too precise for one person to manage. You need a forward observer, someone who can call adjustments, especially in conditions where the shooter can't see the target impact point. She paused. I accounted for one. His forward observer has been out there since yesterday, watching, waiting to see if anyone survived. Rourke reached for his radio. Don't, she said quietly. Any transmission confirms we're here. If he thinks the storm killed us, we have a window. He lowered the radio. He's on the northern rim, she said. There. See the formation 3 o'clock from the valley exit, the broken tooth of rock that leans east. Rourke looked. He could see nothing specific, just rock and snow and the pale pre-dawn light. But he'd learned not to doubt what Elena could see. Range? He said. 1,400. Manageable. She looked at her broken arm. The problem is the rest. And she was right. This was the accounting she'd been running since the hollow. What she had, what it cost, what was left. The arm was splinted but non-functional. The right eye was dark, a shadow where vision had been. She'd been awake, essentially, for 3 days. She'd made the longest shot of her career and had walked 12 kilometers since. The body has a ledger, and eventually it presents the bill. She looked at the northern rim for a long time. "Rourke," she said, "I need you to do something for me." He waited. "I need you to stay exactly here. Don't move. Don't make a sound. Don't reach for your radio." She looked at him. "If I'm calculating this correctly, the observer will try to get a position fix on the post before dawn so he can report back. He has to move in the next 20 minutes, or the light becomes too good for him." She paused. "When he moves, he'll break the skyline at the eastern edge of that formation for approximately 3 seconds. 3 seconds at 1,400 meters, Rourke said, "with one eye, with one arm. The Toknost is a left-hand system. I've been shooting it left-handed since I found it." She looked down at the rifle. "The arm doesn't have to support the weapon, just stabilize it. I have the rock." She gestured with her chin toward the exterior wall of the post, a flat section of stone at chest height, angled toward the northern rim, as though positioned specifically for this purpose. Rourke looked at it, at her, at the rifle, at the one eye that remained focused and steady and alive. "You've been setting this up," he said. "Since before dawn." "Since midnight," she said. "I positioned the rock support and ranged the formation while the storm was still covering any movement." A slight pause. "I had time." He was quiet, thinking about midnight, about Elena standing alone outside the post in the full dark of a mountain whiteout, in -20 temperatures, on a broken arm, ranging a target that didn't exist yet, because she decided it would exist by dawn, planning the geometry of a shot she wasn't certain she'd need to make, preparing for it anyway, because preparation was the only honest response to uncertainty. He thought about the 72 hours, about the specific texture of that experience buried in compacted snow, one eye dark, radio dead, in a combat zone where one of the people who might come looking for you had already tried to kill you. He tried to locate the moment at which most people would have stopped, the moment where the cost exceeded what the body and the mind were willing to sustain. He could not find it. He suspected, for Elena, the moment simply didn't exist in the accessible architecture of her decision-making. There was the situation. There was what the situation required. You either met it or you didn't. She had met it without anyone watching, without any witness, any acknowledgement, any possibility of recognition, under a mountain, alone, in the dark. The thought sat in him, heavy and clean. "Then, what do you need from me?" "Nothing," she said. "Just don't move." She settled against the stone. The rifle went to her left shoulder, her broken right arm, in its splint, pressed against the stone support, not gripping the weapon, just resting, a counterweight. Her one eye found the scope. They waited. The sky lightened by degrees, gray becoming pale, the mountains coming back from darkness into solid form. The snow reflected the rising light, and the world turned silver and still. At 6 minutes past dawn, something moved on the northern rim. A shape, a silhouette. A man crossing the broken tooth of rock at the valley's edge, moving in a crouch, believing the storm had done his work for him. Elena clicked her tongue. Once, twice. Then she fired. The sound rolled across the valley and was absorbed by the mountains. The shape on the northern rim ceased to be. She lowered the rifle. She stepped back from the stone support. She stood for a moment, and then she sat down in the snow, heavily, because the body's ledger had been presented and she was paying it. Rourke was beside her in 2 steps. He didn't say anything. He sat down next to her in the snow, close enough that his shoulder was against hers, and he waited. After a long moment, she said, "That's twice." "Twice, what?" "Twice I've sat down in the snow when I didn't mean to." A pause. "I dislike it." "I know," he said. The sun came up. Not quickly, slowly, the way mountain suns do, edging above the eastern ridge and painting everything gold and orange and briefly warm. Snow glittered. The valley lay white and still and empty, and the post behind them, with 8 living people in it, was small and solid and real. Elena sat with her shoulder against Rourke's and watched the sun come up. Her eye was open. Her breathing was slow and even. The Toknost lay across her knees. "You're going to need surgery on the arm," Rourke said. "I know. And the eye." "I know. They'll ground you." A long pause. The sun climbed another inch. Temporarily, she said. He didn't argue. He had learned, over 4 years, that some things were not worth arguing. They were extracted at 0900 the following morning. The helicopter came in low, 2 birds this time, working the improved visibility with practiced efficiency. Cole's people went first march on a litter, the others walking. Then Hollis, cuffed and under guard, his face carrying the expression of a man who has run his calculations and found the outcome unavoidable. Rourke sent his team on the second bird and then stood outside the post for a final moment. He looked north, then south, then at the sky, which was clear, now genuinely clear, the deep blue of high altitude in winter, the kind of clarity that only existed after a storm had scoured everything soft away. The mountains stood in it like facts, permanent, indifferent. He walked back through the valley to the northern corridor, through the corridor and north, along the base of the western cliffs, 2 kilometers, until the terrain opened into the wider upper valley and the path curved east toward the Nordvik Pass. He walked through the pass. He found the place. The knife was still there, his K-bar, blade down in the ice, handle pointing skyward. The snow around it had shifted and settled, and shifted again in 72 hours of weather. And now, the mound was different, not a mound at all, just a slightly irregular surface, the suggestion of disturbance in an otherwise featureless snowfield. If you didn't know what to look for, you'd walk past it without a second glance. He crouched beside the knife and looked at it for a while. The ghillie wrap was still somewhere under the surface. The destroyed rifle case, the material evidence of a position that had been held and then obliterated, and then she'd climbed out. He thought about that, the specific arithmetic of it. Buried under packed snow, one eye dark, arm broken, radio destroyed, alone in the dark cold below the surface of a mountain in the middle of a combat zone, knowing that the unit she'd been covering had withdrawn and was not coming back, knowing that even if she reached the surface she had nothing, no weapon, no communication, no idea who among the people she knew and worked with might be trying to kill her. She'd climbed out anyway. She'd constructed a plan and executed it anyway. She'd made the shot anyway. He pulled the knife out of the ice, wiped the blade on his sleeve, slid it back into its sheath on his hip where it had lived for 12 years. He stood. He stood there for a long moment without moving, facing the irregular surface that had almost been a grave. The wind came in slow, rolling waves across the snowfield, carrying fine crystals that caught the light and dissolved. The mountains above him were white and silent and enormous, and they had seen everything that had happened here and would carry no record of it. He had been doing this work for 15 years. He had stood at graves that were real, properly dug, properly marked, with a process and a flag and a ceremony that tried to make official what no ceremony could actually contain. He had also stood at places like this. Improvised markers in field conditions, the knife in the ice, the acknowledgement you made when you had no time for anything else. He had stood at too many of both. This one was different. This one was empty. She had taken her absence back with her. He wondered if she knew what that meant to the people who'd stood here and driven the knife in and said the quiet things they said and walked away. Whether she'd thought about the specific weight of being mourned and then returning, or whether she'd simply done the next necessary thing in the sequence of necessary things, and the weight of it was something she filed for later. Probably the second. That was how she worked. He turned and walked back toward the extraction point. Behind him, the surface of the snowfield settled into itself. The place where the knife had been was indistinguishable from everything around it. Within 2 minutes, wind smoothed, powder drifted, erased. No marker, no evidence. Just the mountain. He was 50 meters into the pass when he heard it. He stopped. Too short. A pause. One long. A pause. Too short. He turned. The valley behind him was empty. The snowfield was white and unmarked and still. The sky was blue. The mountains were silent. He listened. Nothing. He stood for 30 seconds, facing back the way he'd come, watching the empty white distance. Then he turned back around and kept walking. He found Elena at the extraction point, seated on a gear case, the Toknost broken down and field cleaned despite the splinted arm, the components laid out on a thermal blanket with the careful orderliness she brought to everything. She was reassembling it left-handed, working without hurrying. "Medical is on the second bird," Rourke said. "I know," Your arm. I know. He sat down on the gear case across from her. The rotor wash from the first departing helicopter pushed a wave of snow crystals across the clearing and then was gone. The sound of the rotors faded. The empty grave, Rourke said. She looked up. Your mound, he said. I was just there. There's nothing. You'd never know anyone had been there. She looked at him steadily. Were you expecting something? He thought about it. I don't know, he said honestly. She returned to the rifle, seated the suppressor. Checked the bolt with her thumb. I was there for 72 hours, she said. I was under the snow for approximately 2 of them. She paused. The other 70, I was somewhere else. Where? She didn't answer for a moment. Then, up. She said it simply, without elaboration, the way she said everything. And then she set the assembled rifle aside and looked at the mountain above them, the peak lost in the residual haze of the departed storm. Rourke followed her gaze. The mountain looked back. They sat in the silence and let the cold and the light and the high clean air be what they were. 2 people on a flat rock at the edge of a valley where something had happened and something else had been prevented, and the accounting was not yet complete and might never be. In the distance, the second helicopter appeared, a small dark shape against the blue, growing louder. Elena stood. She slung the Toknost across her back, left side, good arm through the strap. She adjusted it with the precise economy of movement that was simply how she existed in the world. No excess, no waste, no gesture that didn't have a purpose. Rourke, she said. He looked at her. I want the H&H back, she said. When the snow thaws, there won't be anything left. The barrel will be fine. And the action. She looked at him, one eye, steady and direct and alive. I want it back. He held her gaze. He thought of the knife in the ice, and the whistle on the empty wind, and the impossibility of 3,340 meters in a crosswind, with one eye and a broken arm. All right, he said. She nodded, once. Then she walked to the edge of the clearing to meet the helicopter. Rourke watched her go. The helicopter settled into the clearing in a storm of white powder, and when the powder cleared, Elena Voss was still standing. Still steady. Still there. He thought about what Hollis had said, you should have died, and what she had answered, I know, I decided not to. He had heard a lot of things said in a lot of difficult places, and he filed most of them away in the part of his memory reserved for the ordinary brutal accumulation of experience. He did not think he would file that one away. He thought he would carry it forward in the more accessible part, the part you could reach without effort, without excavation, the part you could simply look at. The helicopter rotors wound up. Snow and dust and ice crystals whirled outward in an expanding circle. Elena stood at the center of it, composed and still, and then she moved toward the door and climbed in, and the door closed, and the machine lifted. Above them, the mountain held its silence. Somewhere in the wind, or maybe only in the particular frequency of cold air moving over granite and ice and snow, there was a sound. 2 short pulses, a pause, one long, faint as a thought. Gone before you could be certain it had happened. The helicopter lifted. The mountains remained. And White Echo was only a story now, or the beginning of one. The kind told quietly, late at night, by people who had been in places they couldn't talk about, and seen things that had no reasonable explanation. Told in half sentences and meaningful silences. Told the way all the true things are told. There was a sniper, the story began. They buried her in the snow. And then she came back. The mountains said nothing, which was the only confirmation that mattered.